Yep. Thanks very much, Chris. And I've got to say that you and your team have made Jenny and me feel very welcome. We feel very privileged to be part of this event. And thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi nui kia koutou I tēnei rā or Valentine. A warm New Zealand greeting to you all on this Valentine's Day. And Jenny and I were able to have a little walk along the Yarra River this morning. It felt very special. You have a very beautiful city here. I also, engari, ko te mea tuatahi, ko he mihi nui ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohi, or Naarm, Melbourne. A special and a very affectionate, warm acknowledgement of the people of the land here in Melbourne. I understand its traditional name is Naarm, but also to all the Indigenous people here in this great continent of Australia. We, coming from New Zealand, we're very struck by the optimism and the energy and the friendliness of Australians. I've felt that for the last 30 years coming over here. But it's really struck me this time, and I'm not quite sure exactly why, but the length of time that people have been here in Australia over compared with New Zealand. So the people of this area have been here for more than 2,000 generations, whereas in New Zealand we have 40 generations, and the difference between those two is immense. You have such a rich history. And our two countries are on similar truth and reconciliation processes, mopping up the Holocaust of colonisation. And I look forward to seeing what happens here in Australia with great interest. Anyway, let's get on with it. Yes, this slideshow is made by blind eye, not AI. I just want to say something. I've been carrying around a stick. It's not a fashion statement. I've been losing sight probably for 40 years. But in recent times, it's become quite critical, and it did bring about an early retirement from the university. It's really given me some insights into the realities of struggle with chronic disease. But John Dobson didn't need to go blind to have empathy for people with addiction. John was one of my main mentors, a pioneering psychiatrist with a huge mind, because he could advocate both for harm reduction methods as well as abstinence-based treatment. He was a pioneer of methadone maintenance, as it was called in those days, and pioneered Odyssey House in New Zealand. One of the things he got into was alcohol law reform. And to my shame, I had quite a lot of discussion with John about how much a waste of time it was to try and change the system. And it took me about 10 years after he tragically died in a house fire for me to have an epiphany. And the epiphany actually came at a conference. It was the combined conference of APSAD and our annual conference in New Zealand called Cutting Edge, where there was a public health stream. And somehow, I'm not sure exactly how it worked. Epiphanies are hard to manufacture. They just come upon you. I thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my career just working in the trenches with the victims. Somehow, John sowed some seeds and they came to fruition at that time. It took a little while to work out what to do. We thought actually if we just created a website, then somehow we'd change the system. We thought websites were quite magical things in those days. But in the end, I got together with some colleagues, and in particular, Professor Jenny Connor, a public health specialist, and then a group of us clinicians. Top left is Dr. Tony Farrell, awesome GP, perhaps just about as awesome as you're awesome, Paul McCartney. Actually, if Paul McCartney is a genius musician, then you're listening to John Lennon, rather sort of broken activist. Jenny Connor there in the middle, one woman for every 4 men. Jeff Robinson on the right, and then 2 psychiatrists at the bottom, Sam McBride and myself. And we developed Alcohol Action New Zealand and really tried to focus on the scientific evidence for what really actually works to reduce alcohol-related harm in a society. And we went to this publication, Alcohol, No Ordinary Commodity, one of a series of monographs that have been put out by the World Health Organization really for about 50 years. And Alcohol, No Ordinary Commodity has now undergone 3 editions, 2003, 2010, and most recently 2022, the year I retired from the university. And we got together as a group and read this carefully and picked out the things that seemed to be the most effective. And we formed an acronym in order to, when we were in front of the media, so we could remember what it was. So marketing, pricing, accessibility, age of purchase, and drink driving measures, plus treatment opportunities for heavy drinkers. I was really pleased you made that comment, Paul, about how happy the alcohol industry is for us to just concentrate on treatment. They're very happy, particularly if we talk about the 3% of people with alcoholism. They get upset when we start talking the truth about how many people in our society are heavy drinkers and causing harm. 25% in New Zealand, and it's very similar here in Australia. This acronym, MPs are acting decisively, is the way we sort of tried to remember it. But in fact, we largely felt that MPs are acting like drongos. But I'll come back to that. I learned something in the whole process of relating to MPs. And the effectiveness of the 5+ solution can be seen there on the left. And around the same time, there was a really good survey in New Zealand by the Health Sponsorship Council. And it found that ordinary New Zealanders, the New Zealand public, and I'm sure this will be exactly the same here in Australia, support stronger regulation of alcohol. Up at sort of 80% levels, very strong. And we, rather naively at the beginning of our journey, thought, well, we've got the science sorted out, strong evidence for these public health measures to reduce alcohol-related harm, and high acceptance by the public. We're on our way from misery to happiness. And we started off Alcohol Action as a series of lectures, and we called it 10 Things the Alcohol Industry Won't Tell You About Alcohol. I'm not going to give that talk to you today, but I will tell you the 10 things we looked at. And I gave this lecture 42 times over a period of 6 months in 2009 to 2010, thanks to the University of Otago giving me some time for a sabbatical. And the beginning of that lecture, I pulled out this this article in 1957. William Menninger wrote, really interestingly, if alcohol was a communicable disease, a national emergency would be declared. The threat to death and the amount of harm that alcohol is causing, if it was a communicable disease like COVID, this is pre-COVID, and we've all lived through that, the government is able to act decisively, but with alcohol, they're just completely asleep. It's not exaggerating to say we're in a crisis, but of course we're adaptive, human beings, and if we see something often, we just normalise it. We just get used to it. So it really isn't a crisis after all. At that time also, I was looking at a few other things, and alcohol industry as an ingenious device as a corporation for obtaining individual profit without individual responsibility. We have, as part of our system, our economic system, these things called corporations, and the alcohol industry is what is driven by corporations. And at that time also, I was reading Stiglitz' book. He was a Nobel Prize economist, and I began to learn about how the economic system is actually running for numbers, not for the health of people. I was starting to wake up, I guess, to things that many others had worked out a long time ago. People like Robin Room, who's one of my heroes and no doubt yours as well. Alex Wodak got in touch with me just yesterday and said, while you're in Melbourne, make sure you make contact with Robin Room. He knows everything about everything. Unfortunately, unless Robin's here today, I won't be able to. Alex Wodak, actually, by the way, knows everything about everything. And the predation of the alcohol industry on particularly our youth. And these memes, life can't be enjoyed without alcohol. We've all been very quietly socialised into thinking that alcohol is really important. It's a necessity of life. And that social events aren't proper events without alcohol. And to be in the in-group, you've got to be drinking with the in-group. The downside of alcohol is hardly talked about. So the first, I'm just going to take you through the 10 things I talked about. These are the things that the alcohol industry won't tell you about alcohol. That first of all, it's a highly intoxicating drug. Of all the recreational drugs, it's one of the most intoxicating and has a pretty low safety index in terms of overdose. It's a neurotoxin. It directly causes aggression. It's an aggressigen. It's fattening in moderate drinkers. It causes cancer, And alcohol cardioprotection has been seriously talked up. And actually that last point has really been worked out well since I did this, some 15 years ago. That's been found out. 3 more things. The alcohol industry actively markets alcohol to young people. This is something they deny without blinking. Low-risk drinking means drinking low amounts of alcohol. And ninthly, a lot of the alcohol industry's profit comes from heavy drinkers, harmful drinking. And finally, they'll do their very best to not hear the 5+ solution as here it is again, and will do their very best to try and see it off whenever public health advocates bring it up. So marketing, the need to dismantle the marketing of alcohol, increase the price, reduce or limit accessibility through hours and places where you can buy it, raising the age of purchase and strengthening drink driving countermeasures, and increasing treatment opportunities for heavy drinkers, which includes, of course, the 3% of people who have alcoholism. But there are a lot more bangs for the buck focusing on the 25% of people who are heavy drinkers. And when you look at some of the research, and there's been some really good research from Australia, Bond et al. Looked at documents of the alcohol industry and found, interestingly, that their concern about the 5+ solution. And it taught me that we're on completely different tracks. They are very concerned about any restrictions in advertising of alcohol. They know that increasing the price of alcohol will reduce drinking. Any restrictions on alcohol sales is not going to be good for business, as is increasing the legal drinking age. They talk about drinking age, and lowering of blood alcohol concentrations for driving would be disastrous. Perhaps not in Melbourne. You've got a wonderful public transport system, one of the best in the world. But nevertheless, we're all addicted to driving around our private motor vehicles, and so this is an issue that the alcohol industry sees as a threat to the bottom line. So that's a little bit of introduction to what happened in New Zealand. Was that a final straw occurred. There was a build-up of alcohol-related harm in the media, and then there was a shooting in a liquor store in Auckland, and the then Labour government set up a commission of inquiry, a royal commission of inquiry by the Law Commission in 2008, 2009. And it was headed by the president of the Law Commission at that point, Sir Geoffrey Palmer, who had been the Prime Minister of New Zealand for a period when David Lange stepped down. And we were just cock-a-hoop when his report came out, because it just vindicated everything that we'd done at that point and were thinking about. And there were 2 things that I remember the day that I opened the report that really stood out. One was his comment that alcohol is a legalised drug. One of the worst things you can say to an alcohol industry advocate, someone who's for the alcohol industry, is that alcohol is a drug. And here's Sir Geoffrey Palmer saying it's a legalised drug. He used the D word. And in rather elegant language, we were talking about the excessive commercialisation of alcohol driving. Sir Geoffrey used this term, the unbridled commercialisation of alcohol being a major factor in driving harm from alcohol. With everything that had come at that point, and so when I say everything, I'm referring to the 5+ solution, having strong science behind it, the public of New Zealand, a high proportion right behind it, and then Sir Geoffrey Palmer in the biggest review of the liquor laws that we'd had in our history. We thought, this is a no-brainer, it's just going to go through. We grossly underestimated the power of the alcohol industry. And when the alcohol reform bill came to Parliament, we immediately saw no reform in it. It felt like 1984, you know, truth is, lies are truth, and peace is, war is peace, etc. You know, those, no, I'm talking about Brave New World, isn't it? Yeah. It's actually not too dissimilar to what's happening in the United States at the current time. Anyway, I digress. We very quickly called it the Alcohol Non-Reform Bill, and did quite a lot of publicity about it, to the point that I think we became quite irritating to the national-led government at that time. But in terms of the 5+ solution, there was just minor tinkering around marketing, nothing on price, and a transfer of responsibility from central, you know, countrywide accessibility to local councils, which could easily be picked off by the alcohol industry. Nothing on age of purchase and nothing on drink driving. And it was just so disappointing. And I think that on reflection now, I feel it would have been good if I'd just taken a few deep breaths. But I didn't. I got angry. And I got angry at the politicians involved. And I picked out 5 of them and found the most unflattering pictures of them that I could find, and did a few talks and talked to the media. There's John Key, the Prime Minister, in the middle at the top there. But I had to acknowledge that there was a very quiet Labour Green voice on this issue as well. Did that mean something? How long have I got to go, Chris? Still some time? Okay, so in reflection, here are the 7 things, 7 facts that I found that the alcohol industry gets most irritated about. If the alcohol industry is not on your back, then they're very happy with the situation. They're creating the victims, we're treating the victims, and we're all happy. It's when we threaten the system, we threaten the profit, that's when we're going to get some pushback. And these were the main things that we found them getting upset about, that there are, in New Zealand, at that time, more than 700,000 heavy drinkers. That's the total population of Christchurch and Wellington combined. And you can multiply all these by 5 for Australian purposes. Alcohol is a drug, I've talked. Supermarket owners are the biggest drug dealers in the country. We have alcohol in supermarkets. You have liquor stores beside supermarkets, which I think is an advantage. But this is where the biggest drug dealer is occurring. excessive commercialisation, I've talked. Alcohol causes cancer. That's a really big one for the alcohol industry. And your awesome Paul actually pointed out to me just last night that Ireland is going to have health warnings on alcohol beverage containers from 2026, warning about the risk of cancer from drinking any amount. There's no safe amount of alcohol, which is an extraordinary step forward for the global advocacy against alcohol-related harm. Social costs are in the billions of dollars a year, and the alcohol industry is doing everything they can to subvert. As time's gone on, there have been now a couple of reforms in New Zealand. The first one around accessibility. The alcohol industry can't appeal determinations by local councils, which is a big step forward. And Auckland and Christchurch, the two biggest cities in New Zealand, now have local alcohol policies on the go. And there has been a zero limit for youth driving, which has been a major reform and is seeing some improvement in heavy drinking amongst youth in New Zealand. I think there are other factors as well apart from this, but I think this is really helping. Okay. Now, I just want to, that's all prelude to me talking about the fact that I ended up in court. I never thought I'd end up in court. And it was a defamation case. We had read this, this really good editorial by Wallace Wallach, warning, the alcohol industry is not your friend. And I've referred to some of these things, but fourthly, they get upset if by people who question what they're doing, and they will call us neo-prohibitionists or other denigrating terms and marginalise them. And we were in the media saying the alcohol industry is in behind the scenes saying not nice things about us to politicians and policy leaders. And the media would say, where's your evidence? They've been to journalism school and they work on evidence. Mainstream media, that's one of the strengths of our democracies. And we didn't have it. We just essentially said, trust us. It's happening though. And we then found some evidence. Well, when I say we found, this guy here, Nicky Hager, an awesome investigative journalist in New Zealand, wrote a book called Dirty Politics, and there were 2 chapters about how industry is in behind the scene denigrating people who are a threat to their bottom line. What he discovered was that the Food and Grocery Council, you've got a Food and Grocery Council here in Australia, and I'm sure it's the same as the one we've got in New Zealand. It sounds really nice and fluffy, doesn't it? Food and Grocery Council. How can that be anything but nice? But it's actually a front for the alcohol industry, the ultra-processed food industry, and the tobacco industry. And what the Food and Grocery Council were doing was paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to a guy called Carrick Graham, a PR consultant, who was writing articles for a blog site called Whale Oil, and then pretending to be multiple people coming on and putting comments. And you see this in social media all the time, people pretending to be other people and putting comments. And here were some of the comments he was saying about me. I had to look up the Urban Dictionary to get some of the meanings here. Actually, when I first saw this, I just laughed out loud, but then I started to get a bit worried about it, and then started getting quite worried about it. Jenny saw a picture of me with a needle through my head, and then another one had my home address. So there was quite a lot of sort of slightly nasty intimidation going on. Anyway, when I say we, it was a different we. There was a person called Boyd Swinburne, who was an advocate on ultra-processed food, and Shane Bradbrook, who was an advocate against the tobacco industry. And a group of lawyers contacted us. They were from Auckland. They were pretty gung-ho. They said that there's a 60-40 chance that you may win a defamation case against these people, and that's going to only cost about $50,000. So between the three of you, you should be able to cover that. We underestimated their tenacity on this case because it ran for 5 years. And so by the end of that time in 2021, when it finally came to court, those costs had really gone up. And we were starting to sweat quite a lot. You know, $150,000, $200,000 is quite a lot. You know, you're starting to think, I'm going to have to get a mortgage on the house and those sorts of things. Quite worrying. Every time we met with the lawyers, they just laughed. They said, no, we're going to be fine. And we weren't so sure. But in the end, we brought this case, and so that's Sellman, Swinburne and Bradbrook against Slater, Graham and Rich as the defendants, and it ended with 2 payments, one by Rich pre-trial and then by Carrot Graham at trial or post-trial. But the most important thing, well, it was important that we won because we had some money to pay our lawyers. I should say that they actually were going to do it pro bono if we lost. So those costs that I talked about before were the costs of the defendants, not our lawyers. But this was great because we could pay our lawyers, and they did a magnificent job. If anyone gets into this sort of trouble, I can give you a couple of names. They'll help you out, and they'll keep you smiling during the whole process. So they really were awesome. But the most important thing for us was an acknowledgement about what they were doing, the kind of evidence that the media had been really seeking and challenging us about. And I wish to apologise publicly for the untrue statements I have made about the plaintiffs. I did so as part of my business and in order to advance the interests of industry, you know, plain language. It was just fantastic, and it went on and on. It was actually written by our lawyers, and then they basically extracted this long, egregious apology from them. It was just wonderful. And they read it out in court. Well, Carrot Graham's lawyer read it out in court after they capitulated on one morning of the trial. We were told it could go for 3 weeks. It actually lasted just the morning after our lawyers said, this is what we're going to show you. And they just gave up at that point. Okay. Are there any alternatives? I'm now just finishing. I hope there's going to be a little bit of time maybe for questions. Good. Are there any alternatives to the usual democratic processes to bring about effective alcohol law reform? Because our normal democratic processes don't seem to be working. In 15 years, we've got what could be seen as 1.5 reforms, and they haven't really done the job. We need 3 or 4 significant reforms to get a significant reduction in alcohol-related harm. So we came upon citizens' assemblies, and I'm not sure if anyone here knows about citizens' assemblies. I certainly think that it could have been useful for the Voice referendum here in Australia. Anyway, citizens' assemblies is a form of deliberative democracy. Here are a couple of words: deliberative democracy rather than aggregative democracy. Aggregative democracy is the kind of democracy, one man, one vote. Well, one man and now one woman, one vote. And it doesn't matter how much you know about any issue, you've still got the right to vote. And that's important for a country. But for difficult issues where actually having some knowledge would be rather helpful before you vote, this is a way of getting a more informed form of democracy. So it's based on citizens becoming informed about an issue before putting it to the vote. And a representative group of the citizenship of a country are brought together, sort of somewhere between 60, 120 people, and are educated by all the stakeholders about that issue before voting. So the whole thing is about being informed and being educated about issues, rather than just being at the whim or referenda sounds, it sounds good, doesn't it? We're going to have a referendum, let the people decide. But they are just open to bias and vested interests and those kind of things. And I've talked to a few people about the referendum here on The Voice, and I think that's what happened here in Australia. Certain biases had the day. So there have been some successful, and here's Ireland again. This is turning out to be quite a civilised country over there. They had one in 2016 looking at a series of things. Abortion in the Republic of Ireland. Abortion reform in the Republic of Ireland. Just think that through. Highly Catholic country, very conservative, but they got sensible abortion review through a citizens' assembly. UK, some good things on social care and also on climate change in the UK. There was one here proposed in Australia, but it failed in 2010 on climate change. If you want to do some more reading about this, this actually is the last paper that I was involved in my career, and we called it a citizens' wānanga, to use a Māori word for assembly. And this is a really good paper. I didn't write it. I just supervised Oliver Sutcliffe along with a colleague. He's now a Rhodes Scholar studying public health, and was a medical student when he came up to me and said, I want to do a summer scholarship on something. And at that time we said, how about doing something on citizens' assemblies? And he's really nailed it with this paper. Okay, so in conclusion, the public health science about alcohol is strong. The number of times the public support is strong for stronger regulations. I can't emphasise that more strongly. I don't think it's really important to realise that Joe Public actually supports stronger alcohol regulation. The number of times successful governments are dismissing is growing, and in 15 years we've only had 2. The key barrier to change seems to be the influence of commercial vested interests in the political process, big money, seducing and putting the frighteners on members of parliament, and in so doing corrodes democracy. The struggle for alcohol reform is actually just part of a bigger struggle in countries like ours for a civilised democratic world where truth and health are highly valued. Where do we go from here? On this slide, I'm talking to myself as much as I'm talking to you. We've got to keep going. We've got to keep talking the truth about alcohol and writing when we can. And number two is especially up there for me. I think if I had my time again, I think I'd try and be more like Dr. Paul McCartney, a guy who's obviously working to build relationships with leaders and politicians. I think this is really critical. Although having said that, I think, to have a band like the Beatles, you actually do need a Paul McCartney and a John Lennon. You do need activists in there as well. Support all litigation against the alcohol industry. Litigation is going to be one of the most important things, just in the same way that it was for tobacco. And advocate for alternative democratic processes such as citizens' assemblies, and there are other forms of deliberative democracy as well. Anyway, thank you for being so attentive, and I look forward to some questions and comments.